Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Bante. And hello, Gita, Ella, Lamu, Stacy, Edward, Ethan, and Jens, and everyone else who is watching but not talking, like Bradley, who's saying hi. Oh, good to see you, Bradley. And we'll start. I don't know what we'll start with, so I'll pass it on to Bronte Sudazo, who will share his ideas.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Well, good morning, friends, and welcome to the last day of our 7-day online retreat. So our first week-long online retreat. So this is a milestone occasion. We've come to the final day. And again, in theory, we've been spending 6 days now practicing samadhi, so developing a very stable, clear, alert mind, and using that as a foundation for cultivating the recognition of impermanence. For cultivating a direct experience of the impermanent, insubstantial, unstable, constantly changing nature of all experience. And yesterday I was saying that it's actually okay to spend 90% of your time practicing samadhi. And it's okay to spend most of your time developing that mental stability and unification and alertness, that steady, silent alertness of mind that we call samadhi. But for this last day of retreat, I would like to recommend that you spend most of your time developing the recognition of impermanence. So by this point in the retreat, your mind should be relatively stable. So unless you've been dealing with some kind of major disasters or catastrophes or issues, your mind should be relatively stable by now. So now it's time to build on that stability by really digging into this practice of recognizing impermanence, of feeling the insubstantiality of the body, of feeling the insubstantiality of the mind, of seeing deeply into the illusory nature of every aspect of our experience. So it's still good, of course, to do some samadhi practice. As a general rule, I recommend starting every period of sitting meditation with a few minutes of samadhi practice, just to make sure that the mind is unified, to make sure that the mind is clear and alert. But not too long, unless you feel you really need it, of course, because ultimately meditation practice is always self-directed. It's always a self-directed internal activity. So meditation teachers like me, we give instructions, we give recommendations, we give suggestions. Every now and then we give commands, but ultimately all of these suggestions and instructions and commands and all of that, it's all just words. And it's up to the individual practitioner. It's up to each person to take that in, to digest it, and to apply it to their own practice, to put it to work in their own mind. So, although I'm saying that for today, I'd like you to spend most of your time practicing the recognition of impermanence, or if you want a slightly more subtle way of practicing, you can do silent illumination, as I've spoken about a handful of times. But again, to start every period with a few minutes of samadhi practice. And if you feel like a few minutes is not enough, then just stay with the samadhi. Stay with samadhi practice for as long as you feel you need to. And also, if you need to switch back and forth a little bit, that's okay. So maybe you practice samadhi for a few minutes and then you start practicing with impermanence for a few minutes. And maybe you find that your mind is not very stable, not very steady. Maybe you find that when you try to recognize impermanence, that your mind gets very restless or unfocused or hazy or unclear. And you feel like it's not going very well. Well, in that case, it's fine. You can go back to samadhi practice for a while. It's really working on steadying and sharpening and unifying the mind for a while. But not to neglect the recognition of impermanence, not to set it aside too quickly or too lightly, but to keep returning to it as something which can radically alter our experience. And with practicing the recognition of impermanence, it has to be the willingness for our experience to be radically altered. So very often when we approach spiritual practice, is we think that we want to change certain parts of who we are, but not other parts. We want to change certain parts of our mind, but other parts we want to stay the same. We want to change part of how we relate to our body, but other aspects of our relationship to our body we want to stay the same. And sometimes this is clearly laid out in our thoughts. We clearly tell ourselves, I want to let go of this, but not let go of that. I want to change this, but not change that. So sometimes we actually are consciously aware of what we're not willing to change, what we're not willing to allow to change. And other times it's subconscious. Actually, most of it is subconscious. It's just this deep instinctual resistance to changes in certain parts of our experience. So one of the first things that people often run into with developing impermanence in relationship to the body is that, as it turns out, most of us are really attached to our bodies. And by our bodies, I don't necessarily mean the physical, bloody, meaty, bony thing, but rather I mean our concept of our body, our perception of our body, what we think our body is. Not necessarily the actual physical thing, because that's a whole different story, but rather our mental and emotional relationship to our body. And one aspect of that is our ongoing expectation that our body will continue to be pretty much the same way it's been in recent memory. But that's not the way of things. So if we want to be aware of reality, then we need to be willing to let go of what we think our body is. And that means that we need to be willing to allow our experience of our body to be completely, entirely different now than it was a moment ago. So maybe intellectually we can accept that, but then as we start actually practicing, we encounter resistance in our mind. This incredibly strong resistance. And often it feels like a deathly struggle because part of the problem here is that we associate the body with being me. Therefore, if the body changes dramatically, then that means I no longer exist. So that brings up this fear of death, this fear of losing me. Which is why it's really important to recognize that a critical component of practicing with impermanence is the awareness of not self, the awareness that the perception you currently have of your body is not you. It's just a temporary perception. It's just a conditional perception. It's a certain concept or idea or habitual way of seeing the body, but it's not who we are. It's something which can change. So our perception of our body can change as time goes by. So, for example, maybe when you were a teenager, you thought that you weren't attractive, But then as you got a little bit older, somebody said something to you that changed the way you perceived your body. So maybe when you were 15, you perceived your body as ugly. And then you were 17, somebody said that you were actually really cute. And then your perception changes and you start to perceive your body as beautiful. So it's a shift in our relationship to our body. So the body itself is neither ugly nor beautiful, but our perception changes. So that's an example of how we know that our perception of our body, our relationship to our body changes. And that also changes what happens when you look in the mirror. So when you're 15 and you thought your body was ugly and you look in the mirror, then you see an ugly body in the mirror. When you're 17 and your perception changes and you think of your body as beautiful, then when you look in the mirror, you see a beautiful body in the mirror. So it changes the way we experience the world. The way we conceptualize and relate to our body changes the way we actually experience it. So that resistance which we encounter needs to be recognized for what it is. It's the product of delusion. It's based on this delusion that the body is in fact a stable, ongoing, persistent thing. And it's based upon this deep attachment to me, to who I think I am, what I think I am. So we need to remind ourselves, this body is not me. This body is not mine. This body is not who I am. This body is constantly changing. This body is insubstantial. This body has no absolute inherent essence. The experience of this body is the product of perceptual patterns in the mind. The experience of this body is the product of habits. The experience of this body is something that I generate within my own mind. Which means it's okay to allow it to change. Because there's ultimately nothing here to hold on to. So the recognition of impermanence naturally leads to letting go. Not because we have to teach ourselves to let go of something we're holding on to, but rather because we recognize that there is nothing which can be held on to in the first place. So it's not like you're holding a water bottle and then you have to drop it. But rather, it's that you realize you were never holding on to anything in the first place. There was never a water bottle there in the first place. There was only the concept of a water bottle. There was the belief in a water bottle, but there was never one there in the first place. So in the same way, we have this relationship to our body where we're desperately clinging to what we think our body is. But that doesn't really exist. The body that we think of doesn't really exist. So I'm not saying there's nothing here, but rather I'm saying it's not what we think it is. So we're trying to hold on to a phantasm in our own minds. And that desperate attempt to cling to something which is illusory causes us no end of torment and struggle. And it impedes the meditation from moving forwards. So we need to cultivate the acceptance. No matter what happens with this body, it's okay. So maybe while you're meditating, one moment your body feels very light, the next it feels very heavy, it feels very hot, it feels very cold, it feels very large, it feels very small. One moment it feels like a human, the next it feels like an elephant, the next it feels like a frog, the next it feels like a cloud. One moment it's not there at all. The next moment it feels like your body fills the entire room. It feels like the whole room is your body. The next moment there's no body, there's no room, there's no space at all. There's absolutely nothing. The next moment it all snaps back. To be okay with these things happening. They may or may not happen to you. That's beside the point. We're not trying to make these sorts of things happen, but rather we are completely open to it, completely accepting of our experience of the body changing in the most absolutely dramatic ways imaginable. And notice the discomfort that comes up when we practice with this. Sometimes you feel it like this burning knot in your belly of like, no, but I don't want to let this body change. Well, I've got some bad news for you. Whether you want to or not, the body is still impermanent. Whether you want it to be that way or not, the body is still insubstantial, still essenceless, hollow, empty, illusory. Whether you want it to be that way or not, that's its nature. So all we're doing is setting aside our concepts and ideas and beliefs about our body so that we can clearly see what's actually real. We can clearly see what the truth of the matter is. That's all we're doing. We're cultivating objectivity. It's recognizing that our experience has been infected with delusional subjectivity for longer than we can remember. So we're trying to cultivate objectivity, an objective experience of body and mind. And that means setting aside all of our premises, setting aside all of our pre-existing opinions and ideas about what we think our body and mind are. And most of this is functioning on a subverbal level in the mind. It's not functioning on the layer of conscious verbal thought. If you could think your way to enlightenment, there'd be a lot more enlightened beings in the world. If all you had to do was read the suttas to get enlightened, well, I would be enlightened by now, which would be great, because I've read all the suttas a few times. And bad news, apparently there's a little bit more to it than just consciously thinking about enlightenment. Apparently there's some training and practice involved as well. So there has to be that willingness to watch as every single thing that you think is solid and real and substantial crumbles before your very eyes. If you have that willingness, then you can start to discover reality as it is. And you've got nothing to lose. Except your dukkha. One of the most powerful statements that the Buddha makes in the suttas, he says this in a few places, but the one which I remember the most is the Kachanagota Sutta, because it happens to be my favorite sutta in the Pali Canon. I used to say that I didn't have a favorite sutta, that I liked all of them, but I was just imitating Bhanteji. In actuality, whenever people ask me what my favorite sutta is, I immediately think of the Kachanagota Sutta. Deep respect for Bhanteji, he's great. But I'm not Bhanteji. For one thing, I'm a bit taller than he is. We've got the same haircut, though. So in the Kachanagota Sutta, as well as a few other places, the Buddha says what arises is just dukkha, and what ceases is just dukkha. So it's recognizing that this delusional perception of body and mind that's arising right now, it's just dukkha. So why would we hold on to dukkha? Why would we do that? Any guesses? Because we're crazy, that's why. And not like the happy crazy, but rather the like self-destructive, lunatic, depressed kind of crazy. And so the Buddha said, it's only dukkha that arises and only dukkha that ceases. So that's the good news, by the way. The bad news, well, it's actually all bad news and all good news because that's all value judgments anyway. So it's only dukkha that arises, which means there's no need to hold on to anything because it's just dukkha. And it's only dukkha that ceases, which means we don't need to be bothered by anything going away because that's just dukkha going away. So we should have absolutely no problem with our perception of our body completely dissolving because that's just dukkha dissolving. That's all. No problem. There's nothing wrong there. In fact, that's great news. Of course, if you expect your body to dissolve, then that's when it's going to feel like a solid, unchanging lump. So we also need to accept that that also is an aspect of impermanence. One of the aspects of impermanence is that sometimes things feel permanent. One of the aspects of insubstantiality is that sometimes things feel substantial. One of the aspects of insolidity is that sometimes things feel solid. That's part of it. But if you wait and watch, then that too will melt away. That too will change. So being patient. When something seems solid, when it seems permanent, when it seems real, patiently watch. Relax your mind. See, is there some holding? Is there some clinging? Is there some attachment? Is it possible that what seems persistent and solid and real just seems that way because we want it to seem that way? Is it possible that we're desperately trying to grab for something solid to give us a sense of comfort and security? Maybe that's why. But no matter what the reason why is, relax your grip on whatever seems solid. Relax your grip on whatever seems persistent and permanent and stable. Cultivate the willingness to allow that to melt away as well. And also the willingness to allow it to stay if that's what it's going to do. So we're not pushing away form. Rather, we are opening up to formlessness. And all of this applies to the mind as well. So what we normally encounter with the mind is, once again, layers of experience. So conscious verbal thinking is the outermost layer. It's the most coarse, the most unsubtle, the most unrefined, the most obvious layer of the mind. And the part which is most obviously constantly changing. It's the part which is most obviously impermanent. A thought appears and then it disappears. An emotion comes and then it goes away. An image arises in the mind and then it's gone. A memory appears and disappears. So that's pretty obviously impermanent. So we can see it there without too much trouble. What's beneath that? These somewhat more subtle currents of mind, currents of mental activity. It's kind of like a river or an ocean. So you've got the waves on the top. So those are like the really obvious thoughts and emotions. And then beneath that, you've got currents, which are a little more subtle, but they still can be very strong. So they're flowing silently, smoothly, but strong. Silent, smooth, but strong. So you start to sink into the recognition that those also are impermanent. They're constantly changing. They're insubstantial. They're not who we are. They're not persistent. They're subject to change like everything else. And so you keep looking deeper and deeper into the mind until eventually you'll hit something that feels solid. You'll encounter some layer of mind which seems like you finally reached the bedrock of the mind. That solid, dense, unchanging surface of the mind on which everything else is appearing. Look more closely. Recognize that that also is impermanent. That also is insubstantial. That also is not solid. That also we can allow to cease, because that is once again just dukkha arising, which means when it ceases, it's just dukkha ceasing. Nothing to worry about. It's not who we are. It's not our essence. When that seemingly solid aspect of mind dissolves, we're not going to die, because there's no me in the first place. And it's definitely not anything in the mind. So you keep practicing in this way. Keep releasing whatever seems solid. Cultivate the willingness for what seems solid to appear to not be solid. And you don't need to force it. You don't need to force things to seem illusory. They already are. I don't need to force that phone case to look red. It just is. I just need to recognize it is what it is. Unless I'm colorblind. Is that red or green? It's red. I know it's red. I'm not colorblind. So really practice sincerely in this way. Practice sincerely with the willingness to allow every single aspect of body and mind to cease, every single aspect of body and mind to disappear, every single aspect of body and mind to alter. If you have that attitude, then the recognition of impermanence with sufficient samadhi can drive right to the heart of all of your dukkha. And that's what you find. As you develop the recognition of impermanence, what you find is joy. It seems scary at first because it is scary. We're letting go of what we think brings us happiness. But actually, what we're letting go of is just our dukkha. That's all. We think our body and mind is what makes us happy, but it's not. It's what makes us miserable. Properly speaking, it's not the body and mind that makes us miserable, actually, but it's our misunderstanding of body and mind. It's our attachment to solid body and mind, to persistent body and mind. That's what makes us unhappy. So we think body and mind is making us happy, but if we're willing to let go of it, then we can actually be happy for a change. So as you progress with the perception of impermanence, what you'll experience is this ever deepening sense of unshakable joy, of recognizing that no matter what happens to body and mind, it has no power to disrupt that joy. So when you're willing to cultivate the recognition of impermanence, that means you're willing to see absolutely any physical experience without flinching. It means you're willing to see absolutely any mental experience without flinching, absolutely any emotional experience without flinching. And also, you're willing to see absolutely any physical, mental, or emotional experience end without flinching. So, a sense of invincibility arises in the mind. And this is not the invincibility of a teenager driving 100 miles per hour in a 25 zone. Um, some of us remember what it was like to be a teenager, in case it's not clear yet. But rather, it's the invincibility of knowing that even as your body gets old and sick and frail, it's not going to disturb your happiness. It's knowing that even if you start to lose your memory, even if you start to lose your higher reasoning abilities, even if you start to lose your ability to rapidly calculate mathematical problems in your head, even if you lose your mental faculties, it's not going to shake your happiness, because your happiness is not dependent upon body and mind. It's not dependent upon any particular condition of body and mind. That no matter what experience appears, you can face it with dignity and serenity. And this is what comes through cultivating the recognition of impermanence. You cultivate an unshakable mind, an invincible mind. a deep, tranquil bliss, which can never be taken away, which can never be lost. So that's why I'm really encouraging you to capitalize on 6 days of intensive practice, and to really dig deeply into the recognition of impermanence today. Really dig deeply into it with the willingness to allow every single thing in body and mind to fade away. The willingness to allow any experience whatsoever to come and go. Knowing that there's nothing to grasp to because it's just dukkha arising, and there's nothing to lament because it's just dukkha ceasing. So I think that's all I'm going to say for now. If you have any questions, you can type them in the live chat, and I'll do my best to answer them.
All right. Thank you so much, Bante. And welcome to Yenny, James, Gita, Alexandra, Ethan, Marielle. Alexander says, good to see you in good health and humor, Bante. And hello, Sally and Raymond. Good to see you. Welcome. And Nora as well. And Marielle is asking, so basically the Buddha is telling us that we're in a place where suffering will come and go in different intensities, and we just have to chill and let it come and go until it's all over. I love you, Marielle.
We should go to Santo Domingo.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
Yeah, that's one aspect of it. Yeah, patient endurance. If you can patiently endure what comes and goes without taking it seriously, then dukkha will just keep shedding away. Just keep falling away from you until eventually it's all gone. Yep.
And Sally's asking, last night during sitting, I tried to observe the body and mind and asked myself, is this aspect I can control or not? Is this okay?
I mean, you can do that. That can be a way of meditating on not self. It's not a technique that I've been teaching during this retreat. And I think especially at this point, it's not good to start introducing new methods. I think it's better to build on the methods that we've been using all along. So I wouldn't recommend getting into that at this time. I would recommend that you try to stick to the methods that we've been talking about during the last 6 days. And if you want to discuss a method like what you're talking about, we should wait until tomorrow or the next day or another day. Okay?
And Marielle says, yes, come. You both have a place to stay already. All right.
Okay, we'll start looking for plane tickets. I hear they're really cheap right now.
And there's no other questions or invitations. Marielle says, well, when the borders are open again since they're closed. Yes, there are a few impediments at the moment.
Yeah, a few minor issues. But yeah, we really appreciate the invitation. And yeah, let's make it happen one of these days. That'd be great. Yeah.
And Sally says, or I asked, is this permanent or impermanent?
I mean, if that helps point your mind towards impermanence, that's fine. Keep in mind that what we're trying to do is to cultivate a direct experience. It's kind of like you're looking at a cake and you're asking yourself, is it sweet or not sweet? Well, you're never going to know until you put it in your mouth. You're never going to know until you actually taste it. I recall one time at a Bayagiri, somebody had baked a cake, but apparently they had used salt instead of sugar. So it looked like a fabulous cake until you put it in your mouth. So you're like, oh, that looks like a delicious sweet cake. And then you put it in your mouth and it's more like eating a salt brick. So that is an example of you don't really know until you taste it. This morning we had a cake that was actually nice and sweet, so that was a different story. So similarly, asking yourself, is it permanent or impermanent? That's fine as a starting point, but then you have to taste your experience. Taste the impermanence. We're talking about a direct sensation, a tangible feeling of the intangibility of things. Okay?
Thank you. And Mehmet is asking, thank you, Bante. There is a common belief that suffering makes us stronger. Do you think that we're addicted to our suffering and we actually desire to suffer?
So first off, the statement suffering makes you stronger is not Buddhist. If that was the case, then we would all be Superman. So I don't know about you, but I haven't been very good at flying lately. And I really don't want to try stopping speeding bullets. That seems a little bit risky. No, dukkha does not make you stronger. Dukkha just makes you miserable. What makes you stronger is recognizing dukkha, recognizing its causes, relinquishing those causes, and cultivating the factors which lead towards relinquishing the causes of dukkha. That's how suffering makes you stronger. But it's not the suffering itself that's making you stronger. It's the wise recognition of it and practicing accordingly that makes you stronger. So are we addicted to our dukkha? Yeah, absolutely we are. And there's two reasons for that. One reason why is delusion. Actually, both reasons are delusion. They're just different flavors of delusion. One is the delusion that dukkha is actually sukha. It's the delusion that what we're clinging to is making us happy. That's one reason why. We think we're making ourselves happy when actually we're making ourselves unhappy. So this was really noticeable. When I was a teenager, I used to go to electronic dance music parties, which people who know me know this already, but I think this is the first time I've admitted it online. And it was always something which I was doing because I thought it was making me happy. But there was always this feeling of dissatisfaction. There was always this feeling of like, okay, this is pretty good, but actually it's kind of crappy at the same time. Especially the next day, I was like, okay, that was kind of crappy. It was kind of good, but kind of crappy. Kind of like McDonald's. It leaves you feeling sicker than when you started. And so that's one element, is that we misunderstand. We think that what is dukkha is actually sukha. So that's one reason why we're addicted to dukkha, is because we're trying to be happy and we don't know how. So we keep pursuing things that are actually making us unhappy, thinking that that will make us happy. Another reason why we're attached to dukkha is because we think it's who we are. So this can be, even when we recognize that it's dukkha, we recognize that it's making us unhappy and uncomfortable, we keep doing it anyway because we think that's who we are. We think, oh, I am the depressed person. Oh, I'm so depressed. Yes, that's me, depressed. Well, what we're doing is that we're so attached to the idea that we're depressed that we keep fueling and building up our depression. I'm not saying all depression is like this, but in many cases, that's what it is. We have a self-identity of being depressed. A great example of this, and this is a slightly more controversial example, but it's one which made a big impact on me. Many, many years ago, I met a man who's a professional cook, professional chef. And he was slightly overweight, but not dramatically so. And I was talking to him, and he said, actually, I used to weigh 300 pounds. And I was like, oh, what changed? Because he looked to me like he weighed maybe 180 or something. So he was a little big, but not dramatically so. But he apparently used to be like really, really, really obese. So I asked, what changed? And he said, well, one day I just stopped thinking of myself as fat. And I was like, well, that's not all it takes, eh? And he said, yes, but the moment I changed that attitude, then I started changing the way I lived. I started changing how I related to my body, which meant I started taking care of it in a way that led to it becoming more healthy. So this was what led to him uh, getting a lot of exercise, eating better food, taking better care and attention to what he was doing with his body. Was he'd given up on that hopeless attitude of like, oh, I'm overweight and I always will be. He'd given up on that hopeless attitude and instead recognized, no, I am not a overweight person. Rather, there is this body which is not very healthy and that can change if I make the appropriate changes in my life. So it's the same. Sometimes we think, oh, I am a miserable person, so much misery. I am the depressed person. I am depressed. I am depressed. I am depressed. And we keep telling ourselves that story until we believe it. And then we think it's solid. We think it's unchangeable. It's set in stone. I am the depressed person and I will be for eternity. We tell ourselves that story and we believe it. And when we believe that story, then we don't change it because that's me. You can't change me because me is me. Well, but actually, it can change. So instead of thinking, I am a depressed person, instead you think, there is a lot of depression in this mind, but if I change the conditions which are leading to depression, then that depression will fade away and change. Just like any other condition. No condition is permanent. No condition is unchangeable. Every condition can be altered if we make the choices that lead to it altering. So often there is this addiction to self-identity as a dukkha-full person. Yay, I just made up a crossover poly-English word, dukkha-full. So we think of ourselves as a dukkha-full person, and therefore we're not willing to drop that. And we keep feeding and fueling our dukkha because we think that's who we are. So yeah, often there is a problem with addiction to dukkha. Yeah, in these two ways. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Bante. So we have quite a few questions. Jens is asking, can you speak more of dealing with the fear that can arise when complementing impermanence?
Contemplating, I assume you mean?
I guess, yeah. That's
I mean,
probably
it's good to compliment impermanence, by the way. It's good for their self-esteem. Yeah, well, to some degree, you just have to face it. Recognize that there's nothing to be afraid of. This is one reason why today I was emphasizing that what arises through recognizing impermanence is unshakable joy. There's nothing to be afraid of because we're not dropping anything valuable. We're just dropping our dukkha. Recognizing impermanence means letting go of dukkha. It's kind of like you go swimming in a sewer, and then you come out of the sewer, and someone's like, "Do you want to shower?" And you're like, "No, I like it this way. It's fine, no problem." Or you could just take a shower, and you're like, "Oh, that's better. That's nice." Yeah, there's nothing to be afraid of because you're not going to lose anything valuable. You're only going to lose your dukkha. And there's nothing to be afraid of because you're just seeing reality as it already was and as it already always has been. And you're not going to go crazy. You're just going to go sane. There's nothing to fear. So also recognizing there's nothing to fear, reminding yourself there's nothing to fear, and reminding yourself that this is a path which has been walked by every enlightened being throughout eternity. Since beginningless time, every single being who attained enlightenment did so by following this path. They did so by recognizing impermanence. They did so by seeing everything as impersonal. They did so by recognizing that everything is dukkha. Just dukkha arising and dukkha ceasing. That's it. Okay.
And Ethan is saying the is quoting, "The uprooting of identity is seen by the noble ones as pleasurable, but this contradicts what the whole world sees."
Yeah, facts. Yeah.
And Ishika is asking, can you please explain what is memory?
What is memory? Ideas in your mind about what you think the past was. That's memory. Frequently inaccurate, by the way. So even psychologists have done lots of studies on memory and shown that people's memories change over time. So what you think happened 10 years ago is not what happened 10 years ago. Most likely, it's a distorted memory of a distorted memory of a distorted memory of something that you experienced 10 years ago. So our memories are not trustworthy and they're not reliable. They're just ideas, they're concepts about what we think happened a while ago. That's memory.
Okay, and I'll go to Ron's question, and then Sally, I'll go back to yours since it's a little bit long. So Ron is saying, why in Circle of Life we are subjected to this test of self-actualized suffering, only to work to liberate from it when this form is incarnation is set to greatest. The one is better off being non-human in this circle of incarnation and reincarnation.
That sounds a little bit muddled and confused. So one thing I will pick out of that, and there's a few non-Buddhist concepts mixed into your question, which would take me a while to unpack and pull apart. But one thing I'll point to is that there is no starting point. So the Buddha said, no matter how far back you look, you just keep seeing beings wandering on, hindered by ignorance, fettered by craving. That's what we see. So there's no starting point. It's not like we used to be perfect and then we became imperfect. We've always been imperfect. But we have the capacity to become perfect. It's not that we used to be enlightened and then we forgot. We were never enlightened, which is why we're trying. So we keep spinning around through birth after birth after birth because we're delusional, because we're filled with craving, because we have this misperception that if we just get the right body and mind with the right experiences, that then things will be okay. But we keep getting nice bodies and nice minds and nice experiences, and things still aren't okay. And sometimes we get really bad bodies and really bad minds and really bad experiences. It's like playing Russian roulette with infinite retries. Except the bad news is all 6 chambers are loaded. Okay, next question.
And Raymond is asking, is it possible to achieve enlightenment for a person that doesn't know anything about Buddhism, but let's say she is a really good person accumulating good karma?
Yeah, so we call those Pacceka Buddhas or Sammasambuddhas. So Pacceka Buddha is somebody who attains enlightenment without any instruction, without any knowledge of Buddhism at all. And they do so through Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, through cultivating morality, mental unification, and insight. Really difficult, takes an unbelievably exceptional person to achieve awakening without any instruction or any information, but some people can do it. It's extremely rare, but it does happen. And the other kind of person is a Sammasambuddha, which is even more rare, and that's somebody who attains awakening without instruction and who has the ability to clearly lead others to awakening, to clearly explain the path to others. So those are also phenomenally rare. But somebody in this day and age, can they attain awakening without any exposure whatsoever to Buddhism? It's theoretically possible, but the truth is that in a globalized society, even people who think they haven't been exposed to Buddhism have probably been exposed to elements of it. bits and pieces of it. This is one thing that I've realized over the past 15 years or so, more than 15 years now, that I've been practicing Buddhism is how much of Buddhist thought, how many scraps and pieces, fragmented bits of Buddhist philosophy and teachings I had already been exposed to through media, through books and movies, and through famous quotes and just things which circulate in a global society. So even people who think they don't have any exposure to Buddhism have probably had some exposure to it without knowing. Okay?
Bradley is saying, Bhante ruined our chances of becoming Pachika Buddhas. Grumpy face. And Sally has a long question, so bear with me. So she says, this is what I wrote yesterday. I started another 1.5 hours sitting. I think after 1 hour, my feet and pelvis started to feel pain. By the way, last time what I typed was totally 2.5 hours in full lotus. I reinforce to focus on breathing. I will see whether this pain can make me die. If so, let me die in sati. So I sounds like a movie. Let me die in sati so that I can be reborn as a monk.
So technically speaking, you can't be born as a monk. Like nobody like pops out of the womb already with the robes on. Like you actually have to grow up for a few years and then go and get ordained.
Anyhow, there was this aspiration. When I can't bear the pain with breathing, I switch to observe the pain. Then all pain gone and body gone, except the tiny pain point at left pelvis still solid. Raptured. Then 1.5 hours ended. I haven't died yet. Otherwise, you wouldn't be writing now. But I lied on bed for nearly half hour. Can't move. Painful feet due to totally 3 hours lotus sitting this afternoon. Sorry, my reporting was long. Is this okay?
And it's fine to rest for a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think you might need to do more walking meditation. If you just do countless hours of sitting and no walking, then you're going to have a lot of physical issues, a lot of body aching, a lot of discomfort in the body. So do some walking meditation. It helps a lot. Yeah, I mean, it's fine. If you want to lie down for a few minutes after doing a few hours of meditation, that's fine. It's one of the reasons why we have break times built into the schedule. Because sometimes you just need to let the body be horizontal and relax for a bit. Yeah, no problem.
She's also asking, if I find a solid mental object, for example, I attach to Samadhi Vipassana like a solid rock. While listening to Bhante's talk just now, I realized there's a gap, loose between the grasp. Is this what Bhante taught?
I don't understand. Can you read that again, please?
If I find a solid mental object, for example, I attach to Samadhi Vipassana like a solid rock. While I listened to Bhante's talk just now, I realized there's a gap, loose between the gaps. Is this what Bhante taught?
So first off, there's nothing wrong with holding on to Samadhi and Vipassana because that's what will carry you through to letting go of everything. And I don't understand what you mean by the gap or loose between the gap. I don't understand what you mean. Sorry.
And Marielle is saying, we don't have to see it as wide as the wheel of life and past lives repeating themselves. We already do that in this life. If you had a childhood trauma that has to do with relationships, you will repeat the same pattern of relationship as an adult until you become conscious of the pattern and heal that part of you. Only then will you in this life stop repeating the same pattern. We have dozens and dozens of that in one life.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so you can see cycles of karma and rebirth in this life. It's true. It also functions on larger scales over many, many lifetimes, of course. But you can see it. You can see it over the course of a few years, a few days, few moments, actually. You can see it operating. Yeah. Any other questions?
That was the last one. So I think we can end it with this morning. And we can meet again this evening at 7:30 p.m. And of course, as soon as I said this, Sally's question appeared. The last question, I mean, when I realize it's not like a solid rock, for example, when I am craving for delicious food, at that moment I throw awakening away.
I don't understand still.
As in, oh, actually, I don't know.
Yeah, so when the craving arises, to see it as dukkha arising, recognize that it's impermanent, and watch as it ceases, and recognize that that's dukkha ceasing. Then there's no problem. Okay?
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much, Bante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll meet this evening at 7:30. Have a great